Hi everyone, welcome to a lecture that I'm sure many of you have been interested in. My name is Hayden and today we are talking about the useContext hook with React. Now, this is just a particular part of React for a particular technique, but let's take a step back and actually look at why we're talking about this. So we have by this point learned how to manage a state within a component. You've used the useState hook, right, where you have a value and you can set the value and React re-renders it. But now that we're graduating beyond these kind of simple components, we actually have to ask ourselves, how do we manage a single state between many components? Or how do we share the state between components? There's really three options we have here. The first one is to pass props down to subsequent components through the tree. This is usually like the best design pattern, but it does add the most kind of boilerplate between code. And it works in many cases. Many people think you might need some kind of global variable, but in many cases you can just, pass things through different components. We're going to look at that first. The second one is to use the ReactJS useContext hook. And that's essentially it's kind of like useState, except you can use it across the entire application. The third way, and kind of the way you're most likely to see things actually happen out in the real world, is to use a proper state management library, such as MobX or Redux. I've used both of these. I used Redux for about 1.5 years, MobX more recently. There's other things we use that aren't these two more recently as well, but that's a bit beyond the scope of the course. It's just a little bit too complicated for the amount of time we have in this course. And it really just helps at scale, but for these little kinds of projects, you just don't need it. So let's have a look at number one first. Number one is passing props down and to manage state. And the way this works is you essentially have a component, it has a state, and then you pass that those state properties or the set state functions down through the chain. And I've made an example here to show you. It's very simple. It's a simple React app. It consists of just 3 files. And I've got it loaded up here. Right, simple React app. And if you look at it, it is a basic application. It's got a use state in the root component, right? Because you have app.js, which is composed of plus.js and minus.js as components. You can see I'm importing them here and I'm using them. On my main component here, I'm using a React useState hook to declare a state that's an integer of value, right? I have a value, I set the value. But what I'm doing is I'm passing along that set value function, passing it by value to my other components. So my plus component and my minus component are able to take these in as props. And actually you can see this. If I console.log props here, and I console.log props here, you can see that functions are passed in. I'm passing in an onClick, remember that props is a dictionary or an object, and the onClick key is a function because it's being passed into both. Why is that exciting? Well, what this means is that on my plus button here, I can actually add an onClick value to the button, where what it's going to do is, when I click it, it will call props.onClick, the function, and it'll set it to be 1. Maybe I could even open these as rows. That might even be easier. Oh, beautiful. Love this. So I've got my plus here, and what happens is on the click of the button, it calls a function, and all it does is it calls the props on click value, which is itself a function, and it uses that function, calls it, and passes in the value 1. I'm going to click plus. See, and this is really interesting to think about, because what happened is my state's actually defined up here in app.js, but I pass in the set value function. So the set value function can be called from one of these lower components down here, but it actually sets the state in the upper piece. To increment this properly, I do actually need to pass value as well. Because there's 2 things you can do. One is you can be like, Well, I'm going to pass value as well, and I'll pass value like this, right? And then in here you can say that props.onClick is equal to props.value plus 1. And then I can do the same thing here, and I can say that for the minus button, that when someone clicks it, I set the onClick to be props.value minus 1. Like that. Nope, didn't work. Why didn't that work? Ooh, that's not good. Props.value, what's going on here? So, let's have a look. Let's console log props, see what's in it. Okay. Something's going strange with value. Let's try changing it to V, maybe? Let's see what this does. Okay, I don't know. Maybe something was strange there. So, I'm just going to use V instead. Now you can see I'm passing in V as 0, and when I click that, it turns into not a number. Oh, that's so annoying. So, sorry, I just paused it to figure out what was up, and I just refreshed the page and it was fine. So, I was like, it looks fine. So yeah, that's what's happening here. We're passing in the value, and we're passing in the set value. So we're kind of delegating the state property and the state function to a lower component, and it's able to call it here and then increase it. Click, 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 and minus, 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 minus. So these plus and minus are two separate components that are interacting with the state defined above. We could obviously clean this component up. Because we're passing an onClick in V, we could instead destructure it right here, onClick in V, and we could just do something like this. OnClick is V plus 1. Right, clean that up even more. OnClick V. Refresh that page. Yep, plus, 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 minus, minus, minus. Now, a way you're probably more likely to see this is that if you kind of know what that component's doing, then you, instead of passing in set value, you might actually do something like this. You might say, when plus is called, the onClick is not the set value function. I actually just want to call a function that sets that value to be value plus 1. So you actually define the behavior up at the higher level, like this, and then you pass that behavior down. That also saves you passing the value down, and it dramatically simplifies your component. Because now your button onClick can just be like this. And in a lot of ways, this is actually better design, because now your button doesn't actually have to be that concerned with what the behavior of the click is, right? It can be more generic. You can have another minus button that say, like plus, 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 minus, minus, minus. Oh God, what have I done? So confusing. Plus, 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 plus. Minus, 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 minus. I don't know why it does that. Yeah, so like you can reuse this component a lot more now, this minus and plus, in like other instances where maybe you have another app.js that wants to increment things by 5 at a time instead of 1. So that's how we pass state through props. Now that's kind of the preferred way to do it, because it still follows the design pattern of components being more modular from each other. But there are instances where you really just need something like global variables. A good example of this might be alert messages or other kinds of notifications, because you can't just, like, if every component could throw an error and you want all those errors to be displayed to the user, it's really cumbersome to like define a state at the very root component for errors and then like pass it through every single thing. It's just not very good. So what we usually do instead is we use the ReactJS useContext hook. This is the one hook we haven't talked about. Let's have a look at it. There's a lot of different ways to use context in React, and you'll see lots of different methods on the internet. Context provides a way for us to pass data through the component tree, right? The component tree is kind of what we had here. To pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. It's exactly what it does. We try to avoid it when we can. We only use it when it's necessary. You'll look at some examples here. They'll all be very interesting. They'll have these things called providers and consumers, and I actually find this stuff very confusing personally, and just a bit funny. So what I've done instead, and this is going to be part of the repository that we give you, is I've created a really simple example to use useContext. I'm just starting up the React app now for it. Let's have a look through the code together. So this is my other file. It's a pretty simple React app. We have our app.js, which is our main component. Now, what you'll see is that I'm importing React Router DOM because I want 3 different pages in this React app. It's a React app to show movies and TV shows. I've got my main route called all, I've got my movies route called movies, and I've got my TV shows route called TV shows. And then I have the actual components themselves. So on the TV route, I'm loading TV shows. On the movies route, I'm loading movies. And on the all route, I'm loading the all component. So they're 3 different components. And in fact, we can see that if we have a look at the React app. That's not it. You can see that I just have 3 different pages, right? So look at the route change and the components that are loaded changes. Now, this is a good problem because what you might actually want to do, and what this app is meant to be for, is that you have a movies page where you can add movies. You have a TV shows page where you can add TV shows. But you want them all to be displayed on both pages and on the all page. Now, you could do this by passing down props, but it's a simple example. Usually the cases you need useContext are for very large examples, and I want to keep this simple. So how do we share data globally between these 3 components? It's something you'd probably want to do in most of your assignments. The answer is we create a store, and I've created one here in this folder called utils/store. And this is a bit of magic, but the main thing you need to look at is that we're using ReactContext here, which creates like a little, think of it like a global variable package. And what this file exports is that store. And we're defining the store as having multiple use states. So what we're actually doing here is we're packaging up different use states, right? Like, because we know how to use those, right? You have the value, you set the value. We're packaging up multiple of those together in this like global variable package that's like a context. And the only place I've had to put that in my application is I've imported store provider here. And again, most of this, you don't have to overthink most of this. You can just literally copy it from these slides. Or it's in the repo. We have a store provider, which we import, and we wrap our entire JavaScript application inside of that. So you'll see our main component here, which contains the router and all the subcomponents. Everything's wrapped in the store provider because you can only get the context in that store provider, so we put it in the very, very outer layer. Now, in a perfect world, you would only put this on like the components that use the context, but I think this is just easier for you know, not large-scale projects. And again, you wouldn't even use context for large-scale projects. You'd probably use something like MobX or Redux. So if you're going to be hacky is kind of how I think about this a little bit, right? Like, if you're using useContext, you're clearly not trying to solve big problems at scale most of the time. I can't imagine why you wouldn't. So I've got my store provider. I've copied the code from the lecture slides. And the only thing I need to update is what these actual things are here. So I put these in, and you might want something different. I want to store movies and TV shows. They're the 2 types of state I want to store, movies and TV shows. So now let's go to one of my components because I've got 3 pages. I go to movies.js and have a look at this pretty straightforward functional component. The key things to note though are these 2 lines here. I get the context from the store, right? So I import store context from the store. I then wrap it in react.useContext, more magic, and I extract the movies from that context, just like I would with React useState. You know how you use React useState? You're like react.useState. Instead of doing react.useState, I just grab the movies component of that context. I grab this thing here. See how we attached movies as these 2 items? So we're kind of like, this is us packaging it up, and here we're unpackaging it here. And now I can use movies and set movies as if it's a useState property, which is really cool. So I can reuse these like design patterns and semantics I've already understood, except it's actually being updated in this global store. So what this component does here, really simple component on movies, is I have a list. That list lists all of the movies that have been added to the state. It's a global state, this one. And I have an input where as people type into it, I have another, it's a control component. So I have a React use state here to like keep track of that value. And then when the button's clicked, I set the movies to be all the previous movies plus the text that's been entered. So what this actually means in behavior is I could say Interstellar, click add. I could say Inception, click add. And what other things I want? Dunkirk, click add, right? So it's just managing state like I'm used to, except movies in this case is like normally a use state only exists in the component, but a use state in this instance exists well beyond the component. It exists also, like exists globally. Now I'm going to go to my TV shows route. Now my TV shows file is exactly the same as movies. It's just for TV shows instead. Do you see how it's just like a different variable? So all I'm doing is grabbing a different part of my useContext, my global store. So I go to TV shows and I type in Simpsons and I type in, I don't watch TV. What do they watch? Family Guy, sure. South Park, great. So I've moved these three things to the state. Now normally what would happen is if you move to another route and you loaded another component, those state variables would be lost because useState only exists within the component. But because we've added these to the global, let's have a look at our all.js now. Our all.js prints out a list of movies and a list of TV shows, and it loads these state properties from that global context. So when I go to all, they're all sitting there. When I go back to movies and I add another movie, like La La Land, and I go back to all, they're all still there. So these are being shared globally between these components without me having to actually be like, you know, pass the props down. So again, it's kind of complicated and confusing, and it confuses me sometimes, but we've given you the sample code. I would recommend that you kind of, if you want to use this stuff, you copy it, play around with it, try and make sense of it intuitively, and then start to pull it into your own project to manage state globally. Should be pretty straightforward.